If you spent any time on Britain's motorways in the last century, you knew an ERF without knowing its name. The tough, square-cabbed lorry grinding up the slow lane with a full load, built to work for a lifetime. At its peak, ERF employed around 1,400 people in a single Cheshire works, hand-building trucks to each customer's exact order and winning 1 in every 10 of Britain's heaviest lorry sales. It survived the Great Depression that had cast out the man who founded it. It survived the war. It survived the death of every rival British marque, Leyland, Bedford, Foden, until it stood alone as the last of its kind. And then, 1 year short of its 70th birthday, the factory simply fell silent. How does a company that outlasted everything the 20th century could throw at it just stop? What really happened inside those gates? Chapter 1. The Old Man and Chassis, 63. In the spring of 1933, in a country with more than 2 million men out of work, an old man began building a lorry that nobody had asked him to build. He was 63 years old. His own family had just pushed him out of the firm that carried their name, and when the first chassis rolled together on the bench in front of him, he did something that tells you everything about the kind of man he was. He stamped it with the number 63, his own age, a quiet act of defiance, cast in steel. His name was Edwin Richard Foden, and he was the son of a legend. His father, the first Edwin Foden, had built one of the great names in British steam. The Foden works at Elworth, on the edge of Sandbach in Cheshire, had been turning out steam wagons since 1856, and by the turn of the century, a Foden steam lorry was among the finest heavy vehicles moving on British roads. Edwin Richard grew up inside that world. He knew boilers and pressure gauges the way other men knew their own hands. By any reasonable measure, he should have spent his final working years as an honoured elder of the family concern, easing gently towards retirement, his name on the letterhead, his opinions sought and respected. That was the life laid out for him. A steam man in a steam family, seeing out his days beside the machines he loved. That is not what happened. The official story, the romantic one, is that Edwin Richard saw the future and the future was diesel. It says he begged the Foden board to abandon steam for the compression ignition engine, and that when they refused, he walked out in disgust to prove them wrong. It's a lovely story. It may even be partly true. But the local historian Alan Littlemore complicates it, and the complication is more interesting than the legend. By Littlemore's account, Edwin Richard was a Victorian steam engineer, through and through, probably the best of his day, a man who actually wanted to keep developing steam, to push it further with higher pressure boilers and superheaters. What forced him out around 1932 wasn't a clash over engines at all. It was boardroom politics, dominated by his own stepmother, who held most of the Foden shares. The visionary who quit to chase diesel, and the old steam man shoved aside by a family power struggle, present both on the mantelpiece, because both were probably true, and the truth of most men lies somewhere in the space between the story they tell and the story told about them. Either way, the result was the same. A man in his 60s, in the teeth of the Depression, cast out of his own company, with his working life apparently behind him. Most men, in that position, in that year, would have gone home. There was no shame in it. The economy had collapsed. Older engineers were being turned out of far more secure positions than his, and going nowhere at all. Around Sandbach, men who had worked all their lives were queuing for relief. To start a new business making expensive heavy machinery, in that climate, at that age, was not brave so much as it was faintly mad. He did not go quietly. He gave the new firm his initials, ERF Edwin Richard Foden, and he leaned hard on the one asset the split could not take from him, his son. Dennis Foden was the organising force behind the whole enterprise, and he took a real risk to be there. Dennis, by his own admission, could not afford to resign from a secure position and feared for his future. He had a family, prospects, a wage he depended on. Throwing that away in 1933 to help his exiled father start again from nothing was not the act of a man following a sure thing. It was an act of loyalty and a gamble on his own blood. He made it anyway. Around the two of them gathered the men who would turn one old engineer's stubbornness into a working company. Ernest Sherritt became chief engineer, the man who would actually make the trucks work. George Faulkner, related to the family by marriage, took on the role of works manager. A handful of men, a rented building, and a name built out of grief and grievance in equal measure. The first truck they built was called the CI4. The letters stood for compression ignition and the number for its 4 cylinders, and in that plain, functional name, you can already hear the philosophy of the whole company to come. This was a 6-tonner, and it was not made of parts they had cast themselves. It was made of the best parts money could buy: a Gardner 4LW diesel engine, the finest oil engine in Britain; a cab built by the coach builders Jennings; a David Brown gearbox; axles from Kirkstall. Edwin Richard didn't try to build everything. He bought the best of everything, and he assembled it into something better than the sum of its parts. It was, in a sense, the only strategy available to a man with almost no capital and a lifetime of knowing exactly which suppliers were worth trusting. But necessity in his hands became a method, and the method would outlast him by 70 years. They took it to the Commercial Motor Show in 1933, the newest lorry from the oldest hands in the trade. And here's the detail that makes Sandbach unforgettable. It was now a 2-lorry town, Foden at Elworth at one end, and this new upstart, ERF, at the Sunworks at the other. Father's firm and father's firm's exile, glaring at each other across the same small Cheshire town, competing for the same customers, drawing on the same local pool of skilled men, some of whom must have had brothers or fathers working for the rival at the far end of the same streets. To the men at Elworth, the newcomers were simply the mob at the other end of town. A family split, played out in steel and diesel smoke, for the whole town to watch. The son had named the company after the father, and together they set out to build a truck that would outlive them both. Chapter 2. The Truck the Hauliers. Cho's the idea at the heart of ERF was so simple that it looked almost like weakness, and it turned out to be genius. Everyone else in the heavy lorry trade wanted to build their own. Foden made its own engines and its own gearboxes. It was a point of pride, a mark of a proper manufacturer, the sign that you were the real thing and not just a firm that bolted other people's work together. ERF did the opposite, and did it without apology. It bought in the best proprietary components in the world, and let the haulier decide exactly what went into his truck. If you wanted a Gardner engine, you had a Gardner. When something better came along, you had that instead. The company would, over the decades, offer engines from Gardner, then Rolls-Royce, then Cummins, then Perkins, gearboxes from Fuller and Eaton, axles from Rockwell and Kirkstall, driveline components from GKN, the customer specified, ERF assembled, and what came out the other end was not a compromise. It was a truck cut precisely to the shape of one man's work. Think about what that meant to a haulier. A small operator running 6 lorries in the Welsh Hills has different needs from a firm hauling steel across the flat Midlands. The big manufacturers offered you a truck and asked you to fit your business around it. ERF asked what your business was and built the truck around that. For a man whose livelihood depended on a vehicle earning its keep every single day, that was not a small thing. It was the difference between a tool and the right tool, and a haulier who had once had the right tool did not readily go back to making do. Years later, a High Court judge would sum up the reputation in words that no advertising department could have improved upon. One of the most popular features of ERF trucks, he wrote, was the Cummins engine. The firm specialized in making lorries to meet the particular requirements of individual customers, and the brand commanded a high degree of loyalty. When a judge is moved to describe your customer loyalty in the middle of a judgment about fraud, you have built something that genuinely mattered to the people who used it. But loyalty and reputation take years to build, and the young company had barely found its feet before the world went to war. When war came in 1939, ERF did what British industry did. It turned to the fight. The lorries went mainly to the Royal Army Service Corps, the men who moved the fuel and the food and the ammunition that armies run on, the unglamorous, indispensable arteries of a modern army. Standard ERF units served with the RASC at the Normandy landings, hauling the supplies that kept the invasion moving inland after the beaches were taken. There is a particular kind of pride in that. A truck designed by an exiled old man in a rented shed in Cheshire, grinding up the roads of France behind the advancing army, carrying the fuel that carried the liberation. There was a catch, though, and it says something important about the assembler model's hidden exposure, something that would echo down the decades to the very end of the company. The Gardner engines that ERF loved were needed by the military. So as the Gardner-powered trucks went off to war, civilian buyers at home had to make do with substitutes, AEC 7.7-litre engines, standing in for the real thing. Here was the weakness inside the strength. When the best component in your truck belongs to somebody else, you don't always get to choose when you can have it. The company that assembles the best of everything is, by definition, a company that depends on everyone else. Hold that thought. It will matter enormously, decades from now, when a change in emissions law takes away the one engine the whole modern company is built around. And ERF did not grow fat on the war. Ernest Sherritt, the chief engineer, put it with the flat Cheshire understatement that runs through this whole story like a seam of coal. "We certainly did not make a lot of money out of the war," he said. "No boom, no fortune. Just steady, careful work, keeping a small firm alive through years when survival itself was the only real achievement on offer." Peace brought the chance to build properly at last. In 1954, the company floated as ERF Holdings, with Dennis Foden as chairman and managing director, the son now fully at the helm of the thing he had gambled his future on 21 years before. The next 2 decades were a patient climb. In 1961 came the first Cummins-powered ERF, the beginning of the partnership that would define the marque for the rest of its life and, in the end, be tangled up in its death. The company was still tiny then, just 315 people on the books. A new cab, the LV, arrived in 1962, the A-Series in 1970. Then, in 1974, came the truck that would change everything, and the single innovation that set ERF apart from every rival in Britain. The B-Series arrived with something called the SP cab. The letters stood for steel and plastic, and behind that unglamorous name lay a genuinely clever piece of engineering, born of a hard, unsentimental look at the thing that was quietly destroying every lorry in the country. Because British trucks rusted. All of them. The steel cabs of the 1960s dissolved in the salt and the rain of British winters until the metal turned to brown lace, and a 3-year-old lorry could look a decade older than its engine. Operators simply accepted it as the cost of the trade, the way you accept the weather. ERF refused to. Its answer was a cab built on a steel skeleton for strength, then clad in panels of glass fibre and moulded composite that could not, by its very nature, rust at all. A key figure in this was an engineer named Jack Cook, who had come over from the rival firm Atkinson, and who understood a truth that the whole industry had somehow filed away under unavoidable. The enemy of a British lorry was not the road, and it was not the miles. It was corrosion. Solve the rust, and you had a cab that would still look proud and hold its value after a decade of motorway punishment. The idea worked so well that it defined the next 20 years of the company. The C-Series followed in 1982. The E-Series, in 1986, launched to real acclaim, and beneath every one of them ran that same stubborn insight. Build the shell out of something the weather could never touch. There were quieter surprises too, the kind of detail that tells you this was a company willing to try things that a bigger, more cautious firm never would. From the mid-1960s, ERF ran its own fire engine business, the bodies built by the old coach builders J.H. Jennings, and supplied a large fleet to London through the middle of the 1970s. And a director named John Bryant, a name well worth remembering for later, ran a marketing campaign he called the Fuel Duel, pitching the fuel economy of the Cummins-engined ERF against all comers on the open road, and winning. By buying in the best of everything, ERF had made a truck to fit any job. It had also made a company small enough to be vulnerable. But for now, in the workshops of Sandbach, nobody was thinking about that. They were too busy building the best lorries in Britain. Chapter 3. Plastic and Pride. To understand what was lost, you have to stand inside the sunworks at Sandbach while it was still alive. Come through the gates on a weekday morning in the early 1980s, and the first thing that reaches you, before you have seen a single truck, is the smell. A sharp, sweet, chemical tang of styrene, the resin used to lay up those glass fibre cab panels. It got into your clothes and your hair, and it stayed there so that a Sandbach man could be picked out in a pub 20 miles away by the faint smell of the trade still on him. This was the scent of ERF's great idea made real, the smell of the rust problem being beaten, by hand, panel by panel, morning after morning. Because that is what it was. Handwork. In the cab shop, men laid the composite into the molds by hand, spreading and rolling the material, building up those unrustable panels the way a craftsman builds up anything, with skill in the fingers that no machine of the era could replace. The molded cab, so modern in its resistance to the weather, was made by some of the oldest methods in the works. There is something quietly beautiful in that, and something very ERF. The future, hand-laid by men who could feel through their gloves when a panel was right. Move down the line, and the character of the place changes under your feet. The chassis shop was heavier, louder, all steel and torque, and the deep clang of a heavy vehicle plant working at full stretch, the sound of it coming up through the floor and into your chest. And here the trucks came together in a way that no volume manufacturer on earth could match, because almost every single one was different from the one before it. This was the assembler philosophy made physical, standing on the shop floor in steel. A haulier from Aberdeen wanted a particular Cummins engine, a fuller gearbox, a specific rear axle ratio for the long climbs he ran. A tipper firm from the Midlands wanted something else entirely, geared for stop-start work and heavy loads over short hauls. The men on the line built each truck to its own specification, reading the build sheet for that individual customer, fitting his exact requirements and no one else's. And then the finished lorry went out for road testing on the Cheshire lanes before it was signed off and handed over to the man who had ordered it. No 2 days on that line were quite the same. It kept a man's mind engaged in a way that a single repeated task never could. At its height, around 1,400 people worked at Sandbach, and they were, overwhelmingly, Cheshire people, very often the second or third generation of the same family to walk through those gates. Fathers brought in sons. A works like this was not simply an employer that happened to be nearby. It was an inheritance, handed down, a trade you were born beside and expected to carry on. The apprenticeships were real, and they were long years of learning the craft properly, and a young man who had served his time at ERF carried that fact with him for the rest of his working life, wherever he went. It meant something. It said he could do a difficult thing well. Imagine the lad arriving for his first shift, following his father and his grandfather through a gate they had walked through 10,000 times, taking his place on a line where the older men already knew his surname. That was the ordinary miracle of a town like Sandbach: work and belonging and continuity, all in the same building. They were proud, and they had every reason to be. They did not call ERF lorries by the model number. They called them the trucker's truck, a man's truck. A driver who was given one to run tended to fight to keep it. There are documented cases of hauliers running fleets that were 98% ERF, firm after firm, sticking with the marker not out of soft sentiment, but out of hard commercial sense, because the trucks kept working, kept earning, kept coming home at the end of a long week, ready to go out again on Monday. The rock-solid Cummins driveline that seemed it would run forever. The roomy cab a man could genuinely live in through a working week away from home. And underneath all of it, unspoken but always present, that this was British built by people just like you, in a town you could find on a map and drive to and see for yourself. The range grew to cover every kind of work a lorry could possibly do. The B, the C, and the E series carried the heavy haulage that was the company's heart. There were municipal versions for the councils, the EU models, out collecting and gritting and serving the towns. There was even a centre steer machine, the EM built for the refuse men. The driver sat in the middle so he could hop out either side. And when certain export markets demanded a steel cab, the company turned to the Austrian firm Steyr and built the ES6 and the ES8. Whatever the job, there was an ERF cut to fit it, because fitting the job was the entire point of the place. And the company's timing, in those years, was extraordinary, because all around it the giants of British lorry building were beginning to fall. That is the thing you have to hold in your mind about ERF in its golden age. It wasn't merely thriving. It was thriving while everyone else went under. The great names of the British trade, names that had seemed as permanent as the roads they built, were dying one by one, or passing quietly into foreign hands. And this small firm in Cheshire, this stubborn assembler that made almost nothing of its own, kept its lights burning and kept its people in work. It had solved the problem that killed other British trucks. It had beaten the rust. It had earned a loyalty most manufacturers on earth can only dream of. It could not, however, solve the one problem that was gathering quietly in the background of every one of those good years, the problem that no amount of craft or loyalty could touch. The problem of size. Chapter 4. The last one standing. By the late 1980s, ERF stood alone. Look at the roll call of the fallen, and the sheer scale of what had happened becomes clear. Leyland, once the mightiest name in British commercial vehicles, had merged into Leyland DAF in 1987, the British giant now half Dutch. Bedford, which had built lorries by the 100,000 and seemed a fixture of the national life, was simply dead. Foden, the father's firm at the other end of Sandbach, the very company that had cast Edwin Richard out half a century before, had itself gone to the American concern Packer back in 1980. Seddon Atkinson had passed to the Spanish concern Anasa, and on again to Iveco of Italy. Guy, Scammell, AEC, the old proud names that had built the country's roads through 2 world wars and the years between, all gone now, or flying a foreign flag. And ERF was still there, still British, still independent, the last man standing on a battlefield strewn with the names of the dead. The numbers from those peak years are remarkable, and they land hardest if you take them in the order the company lived them. ERF came storming back from a brutal early 80s slump that had very nearly finished it. Pre-tax profit climbed from £718,000 in 1986 to £5.6 million the following year, a near 8-fold leap in the space of 12 months. And by the end of 1988, ERF had put 3,740 new lorries onto Britain's roads. That was 10% of the entire market for trucks over 16 tons. 1 in every 10 of the biggest lorries sold in the whole country now came from that small works in Cheshire that made none of its own engines. The men who led it through this were a particular breed, and the last of them carried the founder's blood. Peter Foden, grandson of Edwin Richard, was the last of the dynasty in the driving seat. Born in Blackpool in 1930, he had joined the company as an apprentice after the war, on the floor, learning the trade the same way the men did. He became a director at just 20 when his own father died in 1950, and took full control after Dennis Foden's sudden death in 1960. He had a motto that a whole vanished tradition of British manufacturing could have carved over its gates. If a customer paid 10 bob for his truck, Peter Foden reckoned, but got 20 bob's worth of service in return, then he could always hold his head high with the big boys. Value first, reputation before margin. The customer, always, at the centre of it. It is not a modern way to run a company. It was a very good way to earn the loyalty of the men who bought your lorries, and it was exactly the sort of thinking that would soon become a luxury the industry could no longer afford. Alongside him, from November 1991, was John Bryant, the marketing man behind the old Fuel Duel, now managing director, driving the company forward into what looked from the inside like its brightest era yet. And its crowning achievement arrived in 1993 when ERF launched the EC range. The trade press hailed it as something almost impossible to believe in that late and consolidated age of the industry. The last truck 100% designed and built by an independent British company. Everyone else was now a division of something larger, a familiar badge riveted onto a multinational's shared platform. This was the real, whole thing, drawn and engineered and assembled by a British firm answering to no foreign parent. They gave it a slogan for the company's Diamond Jubilee, 60 years on now from Chassis 63 and the Old Man's Shed, driving the future. The EC went on to become the best-selling lorry ERF ever built. The press loved the story, and who could blame them? The plucky British survivor, the independent that had outlasted every giant in the land, the little firm from Sandbach carrying the entire tradition of British lorry building on its back, up the long hill, alone. But there was a shadow lying over all of it, and the wiser heads inside the company could feel it even in the very best of years, because being the last one standing is not the same as being safe. ERF had never been large. Even in a strong year, its domestic sales were a fraction of what a European manufacturer could turn out in a single plant. And across the channel, the future was already parked, quietly, in the lorry parks and motorway services of Britain. Volvo, DAF Scania, Mercedes-Benz, more power, more comfort. Cabs a driver could sleep in like a hotel room, built with the crushing economies of scale that a small assembler could never hope to match, and getting better, measurably, every single year, while the best of British metal was beginning to look a little crude and a little dated parked alongside them. The whole industry, a judge would later observe, had for years been consolidating, the manufacturers all chasing the benefits of scale, the margins on new trucks kept painfully thin, the smaller makers swallowed up one after another by the larger groups. ERF had watched it happen to everyone else. It had told itself, understandably, that it was different, and in one sense it truly was, in its craft and its loyalty and its sheer refusal to lie down and die. But in the one sense, that would come, in the end, to matter most. The cold arithmetic of the modern lorry trade, it was not different at all. It was simply the last small firm left standing in a business that had already, quietly, decided that small firms could not survive. The men in Sandbach felt like winners. They had beaten the rust. They had beaten the recession that nearly killed them. They had beaten every rival that history had thrown across their path. They had every reason, standing there in 1993, with the EC selling and the profits climbing, to believe the hard times were finally behind them. They could not see the cliff. Being the last British lorry maker felt like victory. It was actually a warning. Chapter 5. Selling the family silver. The trouble with being the last small firm in a business built for giants is that sooner or later someone does the arithmetic. By the middle of the 1990s, Peter Foden had done it. He was in his 60s now, the last of the dynasty, and he could see what the wiser heads had felt for years. ERF was profitable, respected, loved. It was also permanently, structurally, too small. The Europeans were pulling further ahead every year on scale, on spend, on the sheer money required to develop a modern lorry that could meet each new wave of regulation. A firm selling a few thousand trucks a year could not, on its own, keep paying for that. Every fresh emissions standard, every new safety rule cost millions to engineer, and those millions had to be spread across the trucks you sold. Spread them across 3,000 and you had a problem. Spread them across 30,000, as Volvo could, and you had a business. The maths was not cruel. It was just relentless. And it pointed one way. The company needed a bigger family to belong to. Pooled purchasing, shared engineering, access to markets it could never reach alone. So Peter Foden began to look for a partner, and in June of 1996, he sold the company his grandfather had founded in a rented building 63 years before. The buyer was a firm most British hauliers had never heard of, Western Star Trucks Holdings, of Kelowna in British Columbia, Canada. The offer valued the whole of ERF at somewhere around £28 million, a little under £3 a share, only a whisker above the market price. Western Star was controlled by its chairman and chief executive, a businessman named Terry Peabody, whose family owned more than a third of the company. On paper, the logic was sound, even hopeful. Two niche makers, one in Canada and one in Cheshire, each strong where the other was weak, combining their purchasing power and sharing their strengths. ERF's composite cabs, the fruit of Jack Cook's old insight about rust, would even find their way onto a Western Star cab-over project in Australia. It looked, to a tired industry, like a sensible marriage between two survivors. On the last day of December that same year, Peter Foden retired as chairman and chief executive, staying on only as honorary life president. The motto man, the last Foden in the trade, stepped back. 63 years after his grandfather had stamped his own age into the first chassis, the family's hands came off the wheel. It was done for the best of reasons. It was done to secure the future. And it was, in the end, the decision that opened the door to everything that followed, because a company owned by its founding family, run by men who walked the floor, is a very different thing from a subsidiary answering to a boardroom on the other side of the world. Here is where a decision that looked like housekeeping turned, quietly, into the first crack in the foundations. John Bryant, the managing director, the fuel dual man, joined the Western Star board in Canada. At the same time, he took on the running of a bus company, Orion, over in Toronto. The most senior figure at ERF now had his attention split, across an ocean, and two entirely separate businesses. The hands-on British leadership that had steered the firm through every previous storm was, at the very moment the next storm was gathering, spread thin. The man who should have been walking the accounts department at Sandbach was increasingly in a different time zone entirely, because the marriage was not the safe harbour it seemed. Western Star had its own pressures, its own targets, its own quarterly hunger for the numbers to come out right. And a small, cash-starved British subsidiary expected to hit figures set half a world away by people who had never walked the floor at Sandbach is a subsidiary under a very particular kind of strain. Picture the position. Money is tight. The parent wants results. The results are not there, and you are the man whose job it is to make the monthly figures presentable to Canada. Nobody in Cheshire had done anything wrong. The trucks were as good as ever. The men were as skilled as ever. But the pressure now ran downhill, from a Canadian boardroom into a British accounts department, and it fell, in the end, on the desk of one man. The Fodens were gone. And in the accounts department at Sandbach, a quiet man had already started to lie. Chapter 6. The man who balanced the books. His name was Stephen Ellis, and to understand what he did, you have to first set aside the word that most people reach for. He was not, as far as any court could ever establish, greedy. When the whole thing finally came apart and was laid out in forensic detail before a High Court judge, no evidence was found that Stephen Ellis had taken a penny for himself. He did not buy a bigger house. He did not salt money away in some account overseas. He was not a thief in the ordinary sense at all. What he was a man drowning, and pulling a company under with him because he could not bear to let it be seen to sink. Remember that, because everything about this story that seems like a tale of villainy is, when you look closely, something sadder and stranger, and much more human. Ellis had joined ERF back in 1976 and risen slowly through the finance office over 20 years, learning the books the way a man learns, a place he has spent his whole working life. And here is a detail that matters more than almost any other in this story. He was not a qualified accountant. He had never sat the examinations, never earned the letters after his name. He had learned his bookkeeping on the job by doing it, year after year, in one company. For most of his career that had been perfectly enough, because for most of his career the job had been manageable, and, crucially, he had not been alone. There were others above him. There were checks. There was a structure that caught a man before he fell too far. Then, in the spring of 1998, his superior, the group accountant Andrew Williamson, left Sandbach to go and work for Western Star in Canada. And Stephen Ellis, self-taught, unqualified, was left as the senior finance figure at a British lorry maker under mounting pressure to please a parent company an ocean away. The structure that might have caught him had quietly walked out of the door. The first lie came earlier, though, and it was small, and it was the kind of thing a man tells himself is only temporary. In March of 1996, Ellis falsified a value-added tax return, arranging the figures so that the company was owed a repayment rather than having to pay. It brought cash in. It eased the squeeze. Just this once, he would have told himself, just to get through this month. And then, from the middle of 1997, by his own later admission, he did it again, and again. Month after month, he falsified the VAT returns, drawing illicit cash repayments out of customs and excise to relieve the group's financial problems. Not for himself, for the company, to keep the wage packets coming and the doors open and the whole edifice standing. One more month, and then one more month after that. This is how it works, with a lie of this kind. It never announces itself as a crime. It arrives as a solution to a problem, and by the time you understand what it has become, you are already too far in to turn back. But a lie of that kind needs feeding, and in the summer of 1997, the thing that would feed it arrived from Canada. On the 1st of July that year, Western Star's management imposed a new computerized accounting and materials system across the entire group. It was called BAN, and it replaced the system ERF had used before. It was rolled out, in the words of the judge who later examined it, without any period of parallel running. No overlap, no safety net. One day the old system, the next day the new. Anyone who has ever lived through the switching on of a new computer system at work knows the small chaos it brings, even when it goes well. This did not go well. It was, again in the judge's own word, disastrous. For months, the accounts staff at Sandbach could not even extract a basic trial balance from the machine. The fundamental tool of their trade, the single thing that tells you whether the books balance at all, simply would not come out. They were flying an aeroplane with the instruments blacked out. So Stephen Ellis did what a drowning man does. He improvised. He filled the gap with estimated monthly accounts, plugging the holes with trade creditors as a balancing figure, making the numbers add up by educated guesswork because the system that was supposed to produce the real numbers could not. And, crucially, he never told Western Star. He never told ERF's own management. He let them all believe the figures were solid when the figures were, in truth, his best guesses dressed up as fact. Every month he handed up a set of accounts that looked complete and confident, and every month a little more of the gap between the guess and the reality was buried inside them. Here is the heart of it, the thing the simple story misses entirely. A bad decision made in a Canadian boardroom to force an untested computer system onto a British subsidiary overnight dug the hole. Stephen Ellis merely papered over it and then kept papering because he could not face what lay underneath. It was not the fraud of a greedy man. It was the fraud of a frightened one, compounding month by month, a small deception growing quietly into a monstrous one, while the man responsible told himself, each time, that he would fix it next month. The estimates were bad enough. Then came the year-end, and with it, the £18 million that were not there. Chapter 7. The 18 million reconciliation. When the statutory accounts came due for the year ending in June 1998, Stephen Ellis had to reconcile his guesswork with reality. And when he did, he found a gap of around £18 million between what the ban ledger said and what he had been reporting. £18 million. Sit with the size of that for a working man in Cheshire and it is almost unimaginable. A hole that size does not close itself. A qualified man, a stronger man, a man with a superior still sitting in the next office, might have stopped there, gone to the board and confessed that the numbers were wrong. Ellis did not. He had been carrying the lie for 2 years by now, and confessing meant admitting all of it, every falsified return, every estimate passed off as fact. So instead of stopping, he went deeper. He made false journal entries in the purchase ledger control account, the record of what the company owed its suppliers, but that only moved the problem. It opened a fresh £18 million gap between the purchase ledger and the account meant to control it. And a gap like that is exactly what an auditor is trained and paid to catch. So to satisfy the auditors, Ernst & Young, Ellis produced a reconciliation, a document explaining the difference. He claimed that £18 million had been paid to suppliers before the year end. It was not true. Those payments, such as they were, had actually gone out in July, the month after. The reconciliation was a fiction, a single piece of paper built to survive one glance from a tired auditor. And it did survive, because the auditors did not check it. In the flat, devastating language of the later judgment, Ernst & Young failed to verify the reconciliation by reference to the underlying documents, and therefore failed to detect that it was invalid. They took the piece of paper at its word. They did not go back to the source, to the bank statements, to the actual record of what had left the company and when. One check against the real documents, one afternoon spent matching the claim to the evidence, would have unravelled everything, there and then, in 1998, before a single foreign buyer was ever deceived. It was never made. Ernst & Young would later admit, plainly and on the record, that their audits of the 1998 and 1999 accounts had been negligent. So the lie was no longer just Stephen Ellis's private guesswork in a back office. It was now baked into the audited accounts of the company, stamped and signed and made to look like verified independent truth. The 1998 accounts overstated the company's assets by around £20 million. The following years overstated them by around £35 million. The hole was not closing. It was growing, year on year, and now it wore the respectable clothes of a clean audit, which made it far more dangerous than before, because now it could deceive people who had every right to trust it. And then, in September of 1999, came the moment that could have stopped all of it. The single phone call. A retired bank executive named Frederick Poynton picked up the telephone and rang Ernst & Young. His daughter worked at ERF. She had told him something that troubled him deeply, troubled him enough that a man long out of the business felt he had to act, that misleading information was being produced for the auditors at the behest of senior management. Think of what that call cost him. A retired man, with no stake in any of it, no axe to grind, choosing to pick up the phone and report a wrong because it was the right thing to do. He rang the very firm whose entire job it was to catch exactly this. The message was taken. It was reported upward, all the way to Western Star's chief financial officer, David Burke. And then, somehow, in the passing of it from hand to hand, it lost its force. It was not effectively acted upon. The warning arrived, the warning was heard, and the warning was let go. One unchecked reconciliation, one ignored phone call, two chances to stop it, both missed within the space of a year. The lie was now sealed inside the accounts, respectable and audited, and apparently true, and a German buyer was about to trust those accounts completely. Chapter 8. Due diligence. In the middle of all this, at the very moment the rot inside the accounts was at its worst, ERF had its proudest public day in a generation. The company was leaving the old Sunworks at last, moving to a gleaming new factory nearby at Middlewich, built at a cost of some £28 million. And in August of the year 2000, to mark it, they held a celebration they called, without a trace of irony, Coming Home. More than 200 ERF lorries, old and new, cavalcaded through Cheshire in a great rumbling convoy, from the old works to the new. Retired men came back to watch trucks they had built decades before roll past. Families lined the route. Children waved. It was, by every account, the proudest moment of the modern company. A public declaration to the whole county that ERF was not just surviving, but building for the future, pouring millions into new ground, planting itself in Cheshire for another generation. The dramatic cruelty of the timing is almost too neat to be true. The proudest homecoming in the company's history was staged directly over the deepest hole in its accounts. The men waving from the roadside had no idea. Neither, in all likelihood, did most of the executives smiling for the cameras. Only a very few people on earth knew what was buried in the ledgers of the company they were all celebrating, and one of them was doing everything in his power to keep it buried a little longer. Because by now the company had a new owner, or was about to have one. In January of the year 2000, agreement was reached, and in March it was completed. ERF was sold again, this time to MAN Nutzfahrzeuge, the commercial vehicle arm of the great German engineering group, MAN. The price, the judge later recorded, was £65.3 million, subject to certain adjustments, plus the taking on of around £23 million of debt. And what did MAN believe it was buying for all that money? A modestly profitable British truck maker with net assets of around £25 million. A sound company. A going concern with a famous name and a loyal customer base and a brand new factory. A good, sensible acquisition. Stephen Ellis was in the room for the negotiations. From meetings the previous August, at a hotel called the Belfry, he had sat across from the buyers and again represented the accounts as true and fair. He knew they were not. He had built the lie with his own hands, feeding it month after month for the better part of 4 years, and now he watched a German company prepared to pay tens of millions of pounds on the strength of it, and he said nothing to stop them. What was in his mind? We can only guess. Perhaps, by that point, the lie had grown so large that telling the truth had become simply impossible, a door that had swung shut behind him years before. The court would find, in the end, that MAN had been induced to sign the purchase agreement by fraudulent statements made by Stephen Ellis, and, critically, that Ellis had acted throughout as the agent of Western Star, which made Western Star itself liable for his deceit. And then the liability moved again, one more time, in a way nobody yet understood. In July of that year, the American giant Freightliner, part of Daimler Chrysler, bought Western Star, and in doing so unknowingly inherited every one of those hidden liabilities. The bomb had been sold on, still ticking, and its new owners did not even know it was in the building. The men who signed the German deal were not fools. Jürgen Knorp and the others at MAN had done their due diligence properly. They had asked the questions. They had examined the audited accounts, the clean accounts, the accounts blessed and signed by Ernst & Young. There was, on the face of it, nothing to find, because the one man who could have told them the truth was the one man swearing to their faces that everything was in order. MAN thought it had bought a profitable British survivor. It had bought a £100 million lie, and the man who sold it to them kept right on lying for more than a year after the ink was dry on the contract. Chapter 9. The hole in the balance sheet, M. AN changed the year-end to December. It brought in new auditors, Deloitte and Touche, and that was all it took. During the audit for the end of the year 2000, Deloitte found the discrepancy in the ledger. By then, it stood at around £19 million. They did what the previous auditors had not. They pulled the thread, and the whole thing began, at last, to come apart. What the investigation uncovered was almost beyond belief. As at the end of June 2001, there was a deficiency in ERF's balance sheet of approximately £100 million. The company MAN had bought, believing it held around £25 million in net assets. In fact, held net liabilities of around £75 million, a swing of £100 million. The truck that could climb any hill in Britain had, in its own accounts, quietly driven off a cliff. Stephen Ellis had continued the fraud for more than a year after the sale, long after Ernst & Young had ceased to be the auditors, long after there was any takeover left to protect, any target left to hit. He kept the lie alive because, by now, he simply did not know how to let it die. It had become the shape of his working life. The senior figure at MAN Nutzfahrzeug, Håkan Samuelsson, is reported to have called it a big hole in the balance sheet. However it was actually phrased in that German boardroom, that is exactly what it was. Ellis was suspended in July of 2001 and later dismissed. 3 senior United Kingdom managers were suspended pending investigation, among them the chief executive, John Bryant, the fuel duel man, the last living link back to the independent company. And now the reckoning fell, as it always does, on the people who had done nothing wrong. In October of 2001, MAN announced it would keep ERF going, a reprieve. But the price of the reprieve was brutal. The workforce was cut from 770 to 400. Nearly half the jobs, gone. The company was split in two, a manufacturing arm at Middlewich under a manager named Arnd Lutgen, and a marketing business unit under David Smith. 300 people lost their jobs that October. Around 200 more the following March. Roughly 500 livelihoods, in all, extinguished. Think about what those numbers meant on the ground in Cheshire. These were the men from the golden age, the ones who could smell the styrene on a colleague across a crowded pub, the second and third generations, the ones whose fathers had brought them through the gates as boys, the apprentices who had served their years. They had built world-class lorries. They had done everything right, every single day on the floor, to the highest standard in the trade, and their working lives were ended not by anything they made, or failed to make, not by a bad truck, not by a lost order, but by numbers in a ledger they had never seen, entered by a man in an office most of them barely knew, to please a boardroom in a country most of them would never visit. A man who had served his time, who had followed his father onto that line, who had a mortgage and children and a place in the town, would have walked out through those gates one autumn afternoon in 2001 carrying a redundancy notice, into an economy where a skilled truck builder's craft was no longer wanted anywhere for miles. What does a town owe to the men who built its name, when the name is taken away by a lie told 3 floors up? In 2002, 1 year short of ERF's 70th anniversary, 1 year short of the birthday of Chassis 63, manufacture of ERF lorries in Britain ceased. The new Middlewich factory, the one they had cavalcaded home to with such pride barely 2 years before, fell quiet. Production of the surviving models moved to MAN plants in Germany and Austria. The last genuinely Sandbach-built ERF, an EC-11 Olympic, went to a Norfolk haulier, Jack Richards and Son. A firm that had run ERF lorries loyally for years took the very last one off the line and drove it home to Norfolk. A fitting end, of a kind. The last truck the company ever built in Cheshire went to a customer who loved it. The workers lost their jobs in Cheshire. The reckoning would be settled years later in a courtroom in London. Chapter 10. Judgment and the Ghost Brand. Man went to law, and the case that followed was one of the largest and strangest in the history of English commercial litigation. In the autumn of 2005, in the Commercial Court in London, after a trial of extraordinary length and complexity, Lord Justice Morbick handed down his judgment. It ran to hundreds of paragraphs, picking through 4 years of deception entry by entry, and its conclusions were clear. He found that MAN had indeed been deceived, that Stephen Ellis's fraudulent statements had induced the purchase, and that because Ellis had acted as Western Star's agent, the liability now rested with Freightliner, the American company that had bought Western Star and, without knowing it, all of Western Star's hidden debts, along with it. An interim payment of £250 million was ordered, believed at the time to be the largest such order ever made by an English court. 2 years later, the Court of Appeal considered a further, thornier question, whether the auditors, Ernst & Young, could be made to indemnify Freightliner for their admitted negligence. Here, the law did something that feels, at first, like an injustice. The court held that they could not. Negligent, yes, by their own admission, they had failed to make the one check that would have caught everything, but not liable in law to carry the whole crushing weight of another man's fraud. The claims against the auditors, in Britain and in Canada both, failed. In May of 2007, the matter finally settled. Freightliner would pay MAN an indemnity of £250 million, €370 million, and the great English case was over. There was an American chapter too, a separate action in Oregon over whether assets had been moved to defeat the English judgment, which at one headline point reached a figure of around $1.1 billion before it, too, was settled. And there was a quieter tale. The value-added tax that Ellis had drawn out of customs and excise across all those years, the very first lie, the small one that started it, came to around £13.8 million, resolved in the end civilly, the company paying a penalty that was heavily reduced for its cooperation. Here it matters to be precise, because the numbers in this story have a way of blurring together into one great smear of catastrophe, and they should not. The roughly £100 million was the gross hole in the balance sheet. The £75 million was the true net liability against the £25 million MAN thought it was getting. The £250 million was the settlement. The £13.8 million was the tax alone. They are different measures of the same disaster, not competing versions of it, and each one is true. As for Stephen Ellis, there is no record of any criminal charges ever being brought against him. He was dismissed, and he confessed openly in front of the court at the civil trial. And Lord Justice Morbick, a man who had just spent months of his life examining the full, appalling extent of the deception, allowed him one flat, human line in the judgment. It takes a certain amount of courage, the judge observed, to confess publicly to persistent wrongdoing. It is not absolution. It was never meant to be. But it is a recognition that the man in the dock was not a cartoon villain, and it is worth more than any easy verdict. Now for the part the simple story gets most wrong of all. It says the Germans, enraged by the fraud, executed the brand out of pure corporate fury, locked the gates, and killed the name to punish the deceit. They did not. MAN kept building ERF-badged lorries for 7 more years after they discovered the lie. 7 years. The name lived on trucks that were really MAN machines underneath, kept distinct by one thing and one thing only, the option of a Cummins engine. The very driveline that had won ERF its loyalty in the first place, half a century before, was now the last thread holding the badge to life. And what killed that badge, in the end, was not anger. It was arithmetic and a change in the law, exactly the forces that had been closing in on the company since long before the fraud. When the Euro 4 emissions rules came in, the Cummins option was no longer viable, and with it went the last reason for ERF to exist as anything separate at all. Remember, from the very beginning, the hidden weakness of the assembler. When the best component in your truck belongs to somebody else, you do not always get to keep it. The chief executive of MAN-ERF in the United Kingdom, a man named Des Evans, gave the honest epitaph, and it is worth hearing in full because it is the truth the whole story has been travelling towards. Sadly, for this historic brand, he said, because they no longer had a Cummins engine as a differentiator, demand had shrunk to almost nothing, and it was no longer economically viable to manufacture and market the ERF name. In July of 2007, the badge was retired, not in fury, in arithmetic. At that moment, some 20,000 ERF lorries were still on the roads of Britain, still working, still climbing the hills, still coming home at the end of a long week. Peter Foden, the motto man, the last of the dynasty in the trade, the boy who had joined as an apprentice after the war and given his life to the company, died in 2012. Walk through Sandbach and Middlewich today, and you will struggle to read the story in the ground. The sites have been given over, in large part, to housing and to retail. The commuters' cul-de-sac and the supermarket car park settled quietly over the places where the lorries were built. The particular silence of a works built for noise has moved in and stayed. There is no styrene tang in the air now. No clang coming up through the floor and into your chest. No 200 trucks rumbling home in convoy through the Cheshire lanes with the old men watching from the verges. But it is not quite silence, and this is where the story turns, gently, away from grief. Because the ERF lorries themselves refuse to die. A preservation society keeps hundreds of them running, restored and cherished, turned out at vintage shows across the country by people who remember what the name meant. Engines that were built to last are still, decades on, quietly proving the point. Used ERFs hold their value, sought after by working hauliers for the very Cummins reliability that first made the name. The trucks the Sandbach men built are still out there, on the roads and in the fields and lined up gleaming at the shows, outliving the company that made them, outliving the fraud that felled it, outliving the courtroom that judged it. And that, in the end, is the shape of it. ERF survived the Great Depression that had cast its founder out into the cold. It survived the Second World War. It survived the death of every rival British marque, Leyland and Bedford and Foden and Guy and Scammell and all the rest, and stood for years, alone as the very last of its kind. It could beat rust. It could beat recession. It could beat the whole gathering weight of European competition. It could not survive a lie in the accounts. A truck that could climb any hill in Britain could not, in the end, climb out of its own ledger. Not through catastrophe on the road, nor failure on the line, nor any fault whatever in the hands that built it. Through a single false reconciliation, and one phone call that was let go, and a frightened man who could not bring himself to say that the numbers were wrong. The old man stamped his own age into that first chassis in the depths of the Depression, a defiant 63, and set out to build a truck that would outlive him. It did. It outlived him, and it outlived his son, and it outlived nearly everything the 20th century could throw at it. And when it finally went 1 year short of the birthday he had cast, all those years before, into steel.